Welcome to the debate. We are diving into a classic tension today, one that really emerges from the very core of human psychology and, well, modern life. We are asking, are the rapid mental shortcuts we rely on for daily survival actually making us fatally vulnerable in the modern age?
That's right. We're examining this fundamental dilemma that's presented in the material, our dependence on automatic decision triggers, that powerful click war reaction as it's called, and whether this necessity is still, adaptive.
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that automaticity and these cognitive shortcuts aren't merely beneficial, they are fundamentally necessary for modern survival, especially given the overwhelming scale of information we constantly face.
And I'll be arguing, well, pretty much the opposite. The ease with which these shortcuts can be manipulated by skilled practitioners, the exploiters, renders them critically unreliable. The pervasive, sophisticated, and often concealed exploitation we see today means these shortcuts can be dangerously detrimental, often compelling us toward non-rational or even actively destructive decisions against our own best interests.
Okay, so my argument for the necessity of automaticity, it really stems from the sheer reality of information overload. We're so far beyond the capabilities of even the great minds of the past. When John Stuart Mill died back in 1873, he was sometimes considered the last person to have grasped, well, basically all global knowledge. That era is long, long gone. We live in the information age, where data in many technical fields, it doubles every few years. The explosion is relentless. It's even in fields like health, finance, education, things that affect us daily.
I understand the problem with cognitive bandwidth, I really do. But the necessity doesn't just negate the vulnerability.
Well, no, but if we were forced to stop and engage in full critical reflection on the merits of every single action, every piece of data presented to us, the material confirms we would simply run out of time to achieve anything significant. These shortcuts, things like the rule of authority, reciprocity, commitment, they're the essential scaffolding of complex civilization. They enable commerce, defense, social control. They help us avoid anarchy, where life, as Thomas Hobbes might warn, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And when automatic city breaks down, or when we fail to use it effectively, the consequences can be catastrophic. Just think of the FBI's inability to process the sheer volume of data gathered during that 51-day siege at Waco. The failure to use necessary filtering mechanisms was cited as a major contributing factor to the tragedy that followed.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the necessity imposed by modern complexity outweighs the immediate danger of these mechanical, exploitable responses. The psychological mechanism demonstrated in the material, this automatic trigger overriding rational thought, it leads directly to absurd and frankly often dangerous outcomes, precisely because the system is so easily hijacked.
Okay, so what's your strongest evidence then that absurdity triumphs over sound judgment in these cases?
Well, consider two really clear examples of this override. First, you've got the jewelry store scenario. Customers completely ignored the inherent value of the turquoise jewelry. They only purchased it after the price was accidentally doubled. That high price equals high quality shortcut, it was triggered mechanically, replacing any kind of rational assessment of the item's actual worth. Second, look at the case of General Uzal Ent. Here you have a highly trained co-pilot. He knew with absolute certainty the plane was too slow to fly. Yet he still deferred automatically to the general's subtle head nod, interpreting it as an order to raise the landing gear and cause the plane to crash. In that instance, automatic deference to the authority heuristic, well, it caused a physical disaster.
Those are powerful, discrete examples of failure, yes, but they rely heavily on immediate contextual pressure. The shortcuts themselves are built on evolved and usually quite sound principles, like the need to repay a favor, for instance.
Principles that are easily hijacked. As you said, the material shows that small, simple triggers can induce massive, non-rational compliance. Think about it. Minor favors leading to disproportionately large reciprocal acts. We see this in the almost unbelievable story of the $5,000 aid exchange between Mexico and Ethiopia. Famine-stricken Ethiopia sent money to Mexican earthquake victims based purely on this historical, deeply felt need to reciprocate an earlier act of aid from decades before. It proves the commitment mechanism is, well, primitive and deeply overridable by manipulators. And modern exploitation, like the highly structured Tupperware party, which cleverly combines games for reciprocity, public declarations for commitment, and social pressure for social approval, is expert at turning our adaptive responses into critical vulnerabilities.
Okay, let's move to the core of the debate then. Specifically, let's talk about the integrity of social evidence and the principle of internal coherence. You claim that exploiters rely on making these mental cues seem legitimate when they are, in fact, fabricated.
That is absolutely the central point. The integrity of the information we rely on for social proof is frequently manufactured. Social approval in particular is just ridiculously easy to forge. Historically, this involves something as overt as the Italian claque, hired applauders with a price list for different levels of enthusiasm. But today, we see much more subtle manipulations, like the racetrack example, where a heavy bettor places just $100 on a poor horse. Instantly, this drops the horse's betting odds, establishing it as a favorite on the board, purely to manipulate others into following that perceived social proof or what looks like expert opinion.
That's a compelling argument against fabricated cues, I'll grant you that. But I'm not convinced that fabrication guarantees our destruction, so to speak. Have you considered that the material itself suggests we possess the tools to defend ourselves when that deception is overt? The transparency of faked social proof, like really obvious amateur laugh tracks on a sitcom, is described as the exact cue we need. It tells us when to disengage the autopilot. We're being handed the moment to choose reflection.
But that assumes exploiters are sloppy, doesn't it? What about methods designed specifically to prevent us from recognizing the trigger in the first place?
Well, I would argue the defense mechanism against reciprocity, for example, is internal and quite powerful. We can consciously employ what the material calls mental redefinition. We can label a received favor not as a genuine gift, but as what it often is, a sales device. That act of labeling, that awareness, it neutralizes the reciprocity rule before it can really take hold. It shows that awareness is the true defense, not abandoning the heuristic altogether.
But transparency isn't always offered, is it? Especially when the commitment tactic is subtle and crucially self-sustaining. Look at the famous lowball technique in car sales. The salesperson removes the original advantage, say the great price or the free floor mats, after you've agreed. Yet the customer still goes through with the purchase. Why? Because they have already internally manufactured new, often false justifications for the decision. The power of automatic coherence overrides objective merit, even when the original reason for commitment is entirely gone. The shortcut creates its own, highly durable prison of irrational self-justification, rendering your internal defense mechanisms pretty much useless after the commitment is established.
That is a strong counterpoint regarding self-justification, but it still implies we are always helpless victims of automaticity, and that's demonstrably false when the stakes are clearly felt by the individual. Consider the study where students were exposed to arguments by an expert about an impending change to their curriculum. Now, when those students had high personal interest in the outcome, they entirely ignored the speaker's title and expertise. They were persuaded exclusively by the quality of the arguments themselves. This proves that conscious, critical thinking can and does override automatic deference the moment the personal stakes are clearly felt and engaged.
I come at it from a different angle, though. The problem is that many critical decisions are made before the full personal stake is clear, or they are forced into a decision sequence that actively prevents rational engagement. Look at the Watergate conspirators. These were highly intelligent men, right? They approved an expensive, risky, and ultimately useless political plan. And they did this only because it was presented as a massive concession from G. Gordon Liddy's initial, frankly absurd, $1 million proposal. The principle of reciprocal concessions completely overrode all logic and context among these intelligent individuals, leading to a potentially disastrous decision. The mechanism itself blinded them to the quality of the action.
But that still rests on the premise that they were acting solely automatically. Surely there must have been some underlying political objective, some rationale beyond just the concession.
But the need for coherence can actively prevent rational thought, irrespective of the objective. Remember the story of the student preparing to take the Transcendental Meditation or MT course? His friend offered a devastating logical critique that completely destroyed the MT program's rationale. Yet, instead of being dissuaded, what did the first student do? He rushed immediately to pay the course fee. Why? Because he needed to secure his commitment before he had time to think and process the rational, destructive counterargument. He actively shielded himself within the walls of coherence to protect himself from uncomfortable reason. This isn't just a high-level political failure. It seems to be a systemic flaw in our psychological apparatus.
Okay, let's turn to the motivation of scarcity and loss then. The rule of scarcity or competition is, well, undeniably a powerful motivator. We know the thought of losing something is often more motivating than gaining something of equal value. This mechanism is profoundly adaptive for survival. Think about competing for limited resources in a primal environment. And even if the reaction is visceral, what the material calls a feeding frenzy, it also suggests the warning signs are internal and must be heeded. That tightening in the stomach, the gut check that tells you emotion is taking over. This implies the ultimate defense lies in heightened self-awareness, not in attempting to abandon the shortcut entirely.
But when scarcity combines with rivalry, logic truly flies out the window. That combination leads to a kind of psychological fever state. Look at the infamous auction for the film rights to The Poseidon Adventure. The winning executive, Barry Diller, openly regretted overpaying by a massive margin. He later swore he'd never participate in an auction again. Crucially, his losing rival felt immense relief despite having lost the prize film. This illustrates that the shortcut valuing the scarce and contested item actively impairs the ability to assess the item's true merit. The desire to possess the object overrides the desire to rationally use the object, a distinction that just gets lost in the frenzy.
I still maintain that the automatic principles of influence, as powerful and, yes, as exploitable as they may be, remain the necessary scaffolding for an efficient social life. We simply cannot dismantle our mental pilots, as they're sometimes called, because the cognitive consequences of endless processing, trying to assess the full merit of every single stimulus, would be disastrous. The solution, I believe, lies in recognizing the moment of manipulation, that stomach signal the material mentions, and using critical awareness to filter out the false cues, thereby preserving the shortcuts for when they are genuinely helpful.
While they are certainly efficient, I have to insist these powerful mechanical responses are highly susceptible to exploitation by those who'd professionally manipulate human behavior. The pervasive, often sophisticated nature of this manipulation means that our default position of trust in these shortcuts must be replaced with rigorous skepticism. To avoid acting like, well, predictable automatons, we are required to engage in constant mental work and extreme vigilance, a burden that society, frankly, seems increasingly ill-equipped to carry.
Ultimately, I think we agree the material successfully illuminates the dual nature of these psychological principles. They are essential survival mechanisms that, unfortunately, in the wrong hands, become potent weapons against our own reasoned interests.
Exactly. Leaving the ultimate responsibility for discerning the true cue from the fake squarely on the individual, in a world where manipulation feels increasingly like the rule, not the exception.